Doooovid here. We are live once again, 10 o'clock at night, all day of the Science of Consciousness conference. It just ended, and it's in Arizona, which is on the West Coast, so a big time difference. Ended, and unfortunately today they had some connectivity issues. I guess they claimed that there was power outages. I guess maybe could be on where there were power outages. God forbid. I know that we've had power outages in my area, so the sound quality on some of the early lectures was not so great. So that was unfortunate, and it made some of the earlier programs hard to concentrate and focus on. Although, I'll catch it in the review when they post the videos. I don't think, hopefully there's not going to be the sound issue on their video recording. So today focused mainly on psychedelics, and I think tomorrow might be the origins of consciousness, and the last planetary session.
We could also cover what happened with Deepak Chopra last night as well.
Yeah, and then also, last night after we ended streaming for the conversation between Sue Blackmore and Deepak Chopra, which was
it turned into a dumpster fire.
Yeah, if it was kind of like, say, disappointing or whatever, but we talk about that. So I'll let Jennifer give her thoughts, and then maybe I'll do some screen shares of some of the highlights today, some of the notable speakers or ideas that were mentioned today, and then hopefully we'll talk about some things. Notably, one of the researchers had a theory on the entropic brain. This is theories called one of the keynote speakers. Another one did talking about ego dissolution inventory related to psychedelics. Hopefully we'll talk about more. There's another presentation about shamanism, and we'll talk about mysticism.
I think Doooovid means shamanism there.
Well, same word, just how you pronounce it. I actually looked into the etymology. It comes from Russian for random. So Oswald in the chat noticing that LSD turned 79 years old yesterday. John David Ebert had interviewed Deepak Chopra, so hopefully I'm going to reach out soon, maybe next week, to John David Ebert. And so I'll hand it over to Jennifer to give some of her initial thoughts, and then maybe I'll do a screen share of the program and some of the highlights.
Well, I honestly felt pretty bad for Dr. Hameroff during that debate. Was very well. I mean, yeah. What does one say, really? There's a lot I could say.
Well, I mean, because presumably none of the people watching this saw it. I mean, it's possible if anyone attending the conference is watching this. I'm glad you are. But I mean, just to break it down, so most of
it was supposed to be a debate moderated by Hameroff between those two, and it turned into basically a monologue of Mr. Chopra, followed by which eventually coalesced in a heckling of the audience to let her finish her point. So I do think on one level it was dumpster fiery, but the ideas were sort of there was a certain transcendent quality about the debate. It wasn't quite on the level of Adi Shankaracharya, but there were some common themes. And then for today, I have tons of notes on it. Like, I don't know how much you want me to blab for here, but I was flitting around until finally settling on, panpsychism and space-time and consciousness at the end of the day there. But prior to that, the plenaries, I wasn't that impressed. Frankly, I was very deeply concerned with the binaural beats thing. That just seems extremely dangerous to do that when you have no idea what the effect might be. But anyway, What do I know, right? So, yeah, I was. There was a presentation. I don't even remember which one it was, but they were talking about Descartes, mind dualism, physicalism, and oh yeah, it was about It was like an argument for panpsychism using dependent arising as well. And so kind of like a metaphysical simplicity argument from a different perspective. And I sort of seemed like they were hinting at the idea that a non-conscious universe may be incoherent. Hint, it is. Another interesting thing that was talked about was metaphors and what their connection was to language versus mathematics. And that is not well known. So I was interested in the fact that they were going into that. I heard someone refer to randomness as maximum recombinance, which I thought was cool. And then I don't know if you remember, much people mentioned entanglement several times. So I wanted to bring attention to, and I mentioned in the chat, the fact that the Copenhagen interpretation does not mention entanglement at all. And that it's something we've kind of been forced to accept, sort of the way quantum mechanics was, you know, the way it's presented, like, well, we were fine with classical, but then we needed this new doctrine to, you know, reconcile these additional results. Kind of the same thing here. So, yeah, that was some of what. Oh, yeah, and then there was another argument I was thinking about. Someone presented this notion about matter being mostly empty. So I was thinking, if you had a model that was based on emptiness, if matter is 99.999% empty, then your model is going to be potentially accurate to within, you know, the error on your model could be potentially 0.0001, you know, basically 1 minus the emptiness factor of matter. Just a thought. Oswald's asking who I think the best philosophers of panpsychism are today. I mean, I have no idea, because that's like not something I particularly read into. Like, I'm happy with what Stuart Hameroff did, but he's more of a scientist that is helping me establish something in my philosophy. So I don't know that he would even consider himself a philosopher, but he's helped a lot with what I'm doing, just because he's like grounded in experiment. You know, for me to point at someone like him says something that someone like Chopra doesn't. So anyway, I'll think about it, but I don't really follow too many philosophers. Anyway, over to you, Doowovid.
Yeah, so just to, you know, cover what the program was today, and so in the morning it started with altered states of consciousness, and specifically mostly referring to psychedelics, but the first lecture was about shamanism, and it was actually University of Michigan PhD student who did a study measuring the EEG waves of people during a shamanic trance, and specifically drumming sessions, and it showed that they had like a higher gamma. I have to prepare slides or some understanding what the EEG waves mean. Say the like a neural correlate of consciousness, but there was evidence that there was a difference in the EEG readings of the shaman during their practice, most specifically during drumming. So that was interesting.
Oh, yeah, I really liked what you said about the community, drumming circle type thing too. That was cool.
Yeah, and I mentioned in the chat that could have been related to the resonant brain, that drumming increases some sort of resonance. And I was mentioning in the chat, no one seemed to comment on, so to say, the neural correlates of spirituality, that you're measuring the EEG, but saying does that like some of the Indian studies on chanting mantras that is trying to demonstrate, so to say, the presence of the soul or presence of spirituality, that is it possible that this these studies on shamans would demonstrate the power of the spirits, that factually that there are spirits entering them, and there's some sort of neural correlates, but that wasn't necessarily the direction. It was just there was another next lecture, all women in the morning, was on near-death experience, and it was also EG, MRI, and behavioral assessments from near-death experiences, and the psychedelics, the trances, near-death are getting at what is consciousness. When you say, well, consciousness, if it leaves or enters or has peak moments, what would we notice in the brain? And so that's where you have the neural correlates, and you could see different parts of the brain lighting up in relation to. And you really need to know a lot of brain anatomy and physics and neurophysiology. And so some of the lectures are semi-complicated, and then to draw some sort of larger conclusion about the science of consciousness from these neural correlate readings that they get from these studies. Then the next one was the binaural beats that Jennifer was talking about. Unfortunately, they were having really bad sound issues, so I was having a hard time concentrating. I just started playing some chess. So let me just read this. In a time when the pursuit of altered states of consciousness is both leading edge science and mainstream pursuit, the spotlight is on all available methods of consciousness alteration. Elizabeth investigates the power of sound to alter our states of consciousness, specifically the auditory pathway of binaural beats. Current theory in the sound healing field hypothesized that binaural beats filter through our reticular activating system, presenting consciousness altering data to the auditory brain. Binaural beats are a difference tone created by two slightly different pitches. Electric brainwave patterns respond to these precise frequencies and appear to impact correlative states of consciousness. The reticular activating system is a neural network located in the brainstem responsible for modulating our three basic states of consciousness: awake, light sleep, and deep sleep. Clinical studies continue to show positive outcomes in the leading edge field of binaural beats research, and the evidence is mounting for a powerful musical healing technology. So, similar to these binaural beats and taking measurements of the brain, trying to see what they cause. So, what was your? I mean, I don't know if you were sensically
Well, my
worried.
concern is that they're basically microwaving people, and how's this any different from a quasi-lobotomy? And it can cause destructive interference because of the beats phenomenon. And frankly, it could have the same effect as eating a bunch of sugar, which totally screws up your ability to digest it. Like what happens when you take ecstasy? It depletes your neurotransmitters. I'm not saying this is going to be identical to that. I'm just saying doing this kind of stuff, they don't know what the hell they're doing, what frequencies they're triggering. So I just don't even think they should even do this without. If they're even going to think about doing it, they should consult with people who actually understand consciousness. And frankly, none of them does. So that's my big concern there.
Well, and presumably they had to go through some sort of ethics committee or to get funding or do a study, that some sort of peer review ethics of the acceptability of the study. I mean, that was your only comment on it. It was possible ethical.
Yeah, but they already have you can get binaural beats on YouTube. Nobody thinks there's any concern with it, and maybe there isn't, but I still think reckless use of psychic technology is bad karma. Even if there is no bad effect, it's still bad karma. As in, could bring very bad things down the line.
Because you're saying it works.
Because it's
they're just testing.
I don't even want to say it because it's it's not going to bring your religious opinion into this. It's okay, I already know what I'm going to say. People are going to disagree because it's based in a religious.
I'm saying they get test whether it actually does anything, whether it makes a difference, and you're already saying you're worried because you're assuming that it does something, it could do something bad, as opposed to just to test whether it does something at all.
Well, I just know that intentionality is the biggest predictor, and if you intend to play God, that's one of the worst karmas, and attempting to alter the state of mind in that manner, in a passive manner, is playing God. And so I just know it's bad from that. Like, I could go through and figure out technically why it's bad from a ethical perspective.
No,
But
I'm
then
saying
people have to agree with my
if
interpretations on consciousness.
it doesn't actually do anything, then your concerns are ill-founded. I mean, if you're assuming that the ethical concerns that that it could do something and it could do something harmful, versus a test just to see whether it makes any difference at all, and
It's
to
just the carrying out of the test is itself grounds for problems, because it
I'm not sure if
insinuates a
there's
belief
logic
of
to what
thinking
you're
you can
saying.
play God. That's why it's bad.
Well, I'm not following them. They're just testing.
Well, imagine that there
The brain
actually are
state.
spirits. Imagine ghosts are real and they're quantum mechanical spirit entities. They're just disembodied consciousness, and they have psychic powers, and they can read everybody's mind. And what do you think they might do with people that they think things that they're not crazy about?
Well, I'd say that's presumably a rejected hypothesis that this test would
Sure,
be
it's a
designed.
rejected hypothesis, but it's like, that's rejecting it doesn't make it not real.
So I mean, you're just saying
that's where my concerns come from.
you have some superstitious worry about spirits that you believe are potentially real.
Believe is not the right word.
Well, hypothesize.
The people who are in denial of this, they're the ones who are clinging to a belief. I'm just experiencing reality. I mean, I don't want to say I don't have beliefs, but on that level, it's more.
What is a belief? Because unprovable, and this test would be designed to see whether there are any neural correlates to this phenomenon. And then if you're claiming that you propose or believe that there is some effect to this, and this test show that there is or isn't some effect to this, that your beliefs are scientifically unfounded or unjustified. You could still have your belief, but then that'd be the purpose of a test like this.
The test doesn't establish it, because the carrying out of the test is itself disallowed traditionally. Thinking you can carry the test out is itself disallowed. Not that, thoughts are necessarily grounds for anything, but.
Meaning that because of that it wouldn't work, that I'm saying if they measure.
No, because it could work. It would potentially work. Just it would do something. It just, what it would do wouldn't be good.
Well, I mean, according to them, they said all 4 subjects experienced an improvement in brain function and had a calmer brain after adding your BB, which is the binaural beats,
over what time period?
Brown noise,
over what
the
time
music
period?
plus brown noise. Most also showed an improvement in microcirculation or cardiovascular score after listening to music plus brown noise and binaural beats, probably due to relaxation. All of them also showed an increase in bioenergy after adding binaural beats. Binaural beats seem to have produced effects on the physiology of the subject, and since it is not audible, these effects cannot be attributed to the placebo effect. These results are encouraging in terms of developing musical products incorporating binaural beats to affect our neural rhythms. And this is a peer-reviewed published study. So you're claiming that it's inaccurate, or you're saying that that the results are probably true, but there's still some other spiritual, non-physical negative consequence, or you're saying that what you're claiming is a negative consequence could be physically measured also through an alternative experiment?
I think a lot of what you said was right there. I don't want to be a Luddite, but I think if the intentionality is not right, it will end up badly. Even if it seems good in the beginning, I know a lot of things seem.
This is a peer-reviewed study, so you're claiming that it was
absolutely disastrously, frankly.
Well, I mean, you're claiming that it was like fraudulently conducted, and the results didn't show.
Absolutely not. I'm not saying there's any fraud. For a fact that's not what I'm saying. spiritual.
I'm saying you seem to be saying something nonsensical, and if you're claiming that there's negative consequences to it, but it can't be measured, that factually the study did do this and it had the positive effect on physiology and minor relaxation effect, but there's some negative effect, but that's not something that could be measured in a study. And then
I don't want
it can't be measured in a study.
What
are you talking about? You're saying it's not something that could be. You're claiming something that is unprovable, and you're admitting that what you're claiming is unprovable, and there'd be no way to demonstrate.
Depends what you accept as a proof. To me, the proof is already in history. I can say, look what happened in the Mahabharata, blah, blah, blah. I can say the proof is history establishing that what I'm saying is the prudent attitude.
But you couldn't prove by science.
It depends what you accept as a proof. Obviously, certain things require many hundreds of years to establish with any degree of certitude. In this one, I mean, I'm literally citing things going back 5,000 years minimum. So obviously, I'm thinking on the level of I don't want to have a bad effect in 500 years, not in 5 years, and a short-term good effect. Sure, I'm sure people, like when they were first putting out ecstasy, it was like a mood stimulant, wasn't it? It was a depression medicine.
We're just talking about inaudible beats. So like, no, I don't see.
Yeah, well, okay, your consciousness has frequencies in it. Your consciousness is a bunch of frequencies together. And there's light frequencies, and if there are sound frequencies that are not just sound frequencies, but inducing beats, frequencies that are designed to be at the same frequency as your mind, you don't see how that could be a concern.
I mean, potentially, but I'm saying it's scientifically studied. People do it. You say they're available. There's no recorded detriment to it, and they did your peer-reviewed scientific study that showed benefit to it. So I mean, we move on, but now you're sounding nonsensical, especially because you're admitting that what you're saying can't be demonstrated or proven by science.
Well, I just told you it depends on your definition of proof. If you're going to take a 100-year interval on science, well, all right, we can just move on.
Well, I mean, that can't be tested. Whatever you're saying can't be tested. It can't be falsified.
It can be validated. It can't be falsified.
I mean, you're saying theoretically, but saying they did it.
Proven, you have to understand that what can be proven depends on what are the suppositions.
I don't want to get too veered off into some
no kidding
abstract of science, but you're saying something that could be tested or falsified in a structure of something that would be presentable at the conference versus just your own feel.
For me to, I could to me it's obvious, but it depends if you accept the axioms of reincarnation.
Even with I accept the axiom of reincarnation, but you still seem to be nonsensical here.
So there's a bunch of people who haven't reincarnated, who are just sitting there watching us the way we watch TV.
And that
is something that a true statement or no?
I mean, it's possible. I could see that, but what does that have to do with binaural beats?
It has to do with binaural beats, as in there are people who are not alive who watch what we do and fuck us over as a consequence to them not liking what we do. And there's a hierarchy of things they don't like that we do.
What is
that? And playing God's one of them.
How is binaural beats to the brain and measuring it playing God?
Believing that it's your role to go in and play with someone's mind on that level. That's playing God. At the very least, it's playing a priest.
These are all of the tests. I'm saying, what's the difference between these tests, that every single one of these tests of the neural correlates of consciousness? Why are you focusing on
binaural beats interfere with the consciousness. If you're hammer off and you've got like things on someone's head to figure out if they're conscious, that's a one-way thing. That's consciousness going away from the brain, getting measured by a device, not sending intentionally the same frequencies as consciousness into the brain. I'm not saying that this is in any way anyone's fault or intention. I'm just saying that even if people don't know that what they're doing is bad karma, they could still get bad consequences even if you don't know that what you're doing is bad karma. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, you're just you're hypothesizing as bad karma. I haven't seen you bring any reason to state that you say
you're
that,
hypothesizing that you can do these kinds of experiments with no consequences. I'm saying, okay,
it's been done. I didn't do it. I'm not hypo. It's been done. We watched it today, and you seem like some mad woman that you're like scared of something that you can't articulate, and now you're saying it's something to do with like reincarnated spirits, and that somehow these binaural beats are bad karma, and no, I mean, you're not making sense. I mean, if you're saying something, say it, but like, I mean, especially like, no, I mean, you're not making sense here. I'm sorry.
All right, I guess I skipped too many steps.
I mean, you have to think it through. I mean, just say that.
Well,
you think
I don't. To me, it's self-evident. So, what part of that didn't make sense? I mean, to me, it's like, yeah, obviously, no one's following.
It doesn't matter to you. I say if you can't communicate it, then it's irrelevant. I mean, so you just say like, warning, you're scared that there's some bad karma there, but you can't explain it.
Well, do you know what a curse is? You believe in curses?
Well, it doesn't matter whether I believe in it, and we're talking the science of consciousness.
So is it possible to get cursed for doing something that's sufficiently offensive?
I mean, depending how you define curse, you would say like, yeah, if there's bad karma, you do something.
All right, well, there you go. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying I'm sitting there with a cauldron. I'm saying there are levels that shouldn't be breached, and playing God in someone else's head is one of them.
Yeah, I mean, if you state, but that you still haven't shown that this, these binaural beats are this.
Don't you understand? It's the intention. It's the intention that matters.
Well, now you say like a mind reader.
Doesn't matter what it is.
A mind reader that you're reading into this woman that the Institute of Human Science, where she's claiming she's doing this for a health benefit, and now you're claiming some sort of intention that she's trying to play God, when clearly it's written that her intention is a healing exercise.
Sure.
And there was even
the spirits care. If there's victims, would the spirits care what the person perpetuating the crime is deceiving themselves into thinking, though?
I'm not sure. I mean, if anyone,
the spirits only care about intention, right? That's all they can read. So all I'm saying is, if your intention is to
now you're hypothesizing about unscientific things, and that's fine. But and for whatever reason, this binaural beats thing triggered you.
This is perfectly reasonable according to science. If you accept consciousness hypothesis, the most reasonable deductions about non-living consciousness is perfectly reasonable. But whatever, I understand why it would seem unlikely.
Well, I mean, it's your own fault. Like, so if you have something to say, you're not explaining it right, and you just sound irrationally triggered. But I mean, it's possible that you have something to say and just haven't figured out to articulate it. Okay, so the next one was the keynote on, I mean, it seemed like a pretty natural experiment on binaural beats and using the same style of experimentation as all the other ones, which is just the various neural correlates of consciousness, measuring the EG, HRV, GSR, various whatever things of the neural correlates of consciousness are measurable, and which is in essence what they're doing with all of the experiments. And if there's an input, some of them, like the shaman, they had also input. They played classical music. They, if it was self-induced, or like I mentioned yesterday, like in emotions, that they could show pictures. They could ask the person to focus or meditate, or they could try to induce it. Obviously, like a lot of these are on psychedelics, so they're actually talking about people taking drugs, and whatever reason Jennifer's triggered on this binaural beats. Like, maybe she'll think about it and get back to us on it. So the main presentation.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, okay. And the main presentation on psychedelics, uh, Robert K. Hart Harris from Imperial College London. Uh, Multi-level approach to the question of how psychedelics work in the brain. Key themes include the pharmacology of classic serotonergic psychedelics, what this tells us on the current developmental and evolutionary function of serotonin 2A receptor signalings and acute brain effects as psychedelics are determined by functional brain imaging, current evidence for psychedelic therapy, the Rebus model for the action of psychedelics and how this maps onto the phenomenology of the acute psychedelic experience, and therapeutic outcomes. The talk will end with a focus on recent double-blind RCT and comparing uh, psilocybin therapy with the established antidepressant drug in the treatment of depression. So a lot of these were pharmacological, and you're talking like neurotransmitters and like serotonin, endorphins, or these various neurophysiological measurements specifically related to the neural correlates of consciousness, and psychedelics that would artificially change the balance of neurophysiology by not necessarily introducing substances that aren't in the brain naturally, but changing the natural balance. And I've been reading up and trying to study more and more, and I said, like, yeah, do a lot of homework and understand um, brain anatomy, and a lot of these people have PhDs in medicine and neuropsychology and various things. So it
Did
was,
you see the diagram where the level of consciousness seemed to be higher when they were on drugs? Like they had a comparative state of when you were asleep, it was really low, and then awake, it was a little higher, and then on psychedelics, it was even higher. So I thought that was really interesting, and how they were trying to connect the effectiveness of the drugs to the microtubules lattice.
yeah, I mean, so I mean, it's almost semi-obvious. So if you're talking like the uh, the binaural beats or shamanic meditative induced states versus um, psychedelics, which is similar to anesthesiology, where you're talking about a drug administered that induces a changed state of an altered state of consciousness, specifically to shutting down consciousness, like anesthesiology, but psychedelics that would enhance consciousness, and then that would be measurable. So that's what most of these studies talked about. The next one was the director of the University of Michigan, my alma mater, Center for Consciousness Science, George Mashore, talking about psychedelic mechanisms. And this was a lot of biochemistry and neurophysics. And he talked about the sub-anesthetic ketamine and nitrous oxide on neuronal spike activity, cortical
Yeah,
information.
they were saying the ketamine was the most similar to the states induced by the meditators. They had that whole big diagram there.
Yeah, and unfortunately, like this, there was still sound problems in this, so I ended up just like playing some chess and wasn't concentrating enough because they had connection issues. So I watched that back in the replay. But yeah, so this was quite a bit about neurophysiology, and somewhat obvious, but
I managed to actually grab a screenshot of it. Yeah, ketamine was at the highest similarity. It says semantic similarity with drug-induced experiences, and there's a whole bunch of serotogenic, entactogen, dissociative, deliriant, depressive, stimulant, antipsychotic, MAOI. And they said the highest similarity was the ketamine, LSD, 5-MeO-DMT, and mushrooms. Interesting stuff.
yeah. So
They said this was the most similar to near-death experiences. My bad.
Yeah, after I finish going over the program, we'll talk more about the meaning of this. But the neural correlates of consciousness and altered states of consciousness, what happens in the brain during these different states, and if it's induced by near-death experience, by anesthetics, by psychedelics, by meditation, by sound, whatever it's induced by, just having a study and understanding the mechanisms of the brain and what is actually happening. Like yesterday, we talked to like the latest science in the neuroanatomy of neurons on the smallest level in the orchestrated objective reduction and the microtubules. So a lot of this is just a review of biochemistry. And so the next presentation, Alex Wan from Yale, was about antidepressants and optical imaging methods to show how drugs such as ketamine and psilocybin modify the structure and function of brain circuitry. Then Kartin Preller, also from Yale, from Germany, investigated the neurobiological long-term effects of cocaine, MDMA, and heroin use. Read here. Show that LSD and psilocybin modulate brain connectivity and subjective effects via agonistic activity in the serotonin 2A receptor in humans. Furthermore, elucidated the neuropharmacology of self-relevance and meaning processing, as well as the intertwined relationship between self-processing and social cognition via the administration of LSD and psilocybin. So I'm not exactly sure how they did these studies. I know tomorrow actually they're having, maybe on Friday, that Michael Cremo, the Hare Krishna from Forbidden Archaeology, where he actually talks about participating in CIA LSD experiments in the 60s, and like Haight-Ashbury and the name slipping me, Todd from Politically Provoked's always talking about that, like the MI or whatever the CIA program was, where they gave LSD to people, including the early Hare Krishna movement and Allen Ginsberg and Haight-Ashbury. And so Michael Cremo, who now is author and on the board of directors of the Temple of Vedic Planetarium, was part of these CIA LSD experiments in the 60s, and he will be speaking about it. So I'm not sure how Katrine Preller, if how they whatever, but they did these also experiments now with the latest neuroimaging, neurocorrelates of consciousness technologies on LSD users. So it was interesting. It said there was some connectivity issues, so I'll have to check back when they post the video. And then, so tomorrow in the morning will be time and consciousness. Should be interesting. Time's Broken Arrow. Professor Sheehan from the Department of Physics, University of California, San Diego. And then Paul Davies on cosmology, time's flow is an illusion. And then Roger Penrose. And then they're going to be on astrobiology and astroconsciousness. Avi Loeb, Israeli Harvard professor, best-selling author. The Galileo Project. And then there's going to be a session on the origin of life and the origin of consciousness from an evolutionary perspective. And then Friday will be theories of consciousness. So, and then, they had this planetary, and I went to theories of consciousness, which is kind of overview of the various approaches. So that was today's. Let me just share a few things. So this was just a historical. Anyone who wants to know more about this Science of Consciousness conference, I was looking, we're like the only news story, the only only people covering the science consciousness conference period. So it started in 1991, and one of the people who at the very first one, Jeremy Horn, wrote an article about the origins of the conference, and I guess it's changed names. And the first one had 60 people, and they charged $5. And you could see the, I guess it was just a one-day Sunday session. And then Hamerov got together, put it, made it yearly or every 2 years, eventually becoming every year. He put out a call for papers, and then they got David Chalmers to participate in 1995. Chalmers participated in the conference for the first time, and he wrote that his famous book and Delineation of the Hard Problem of Consciousness, and the various type quacks and spiritualists, and and published papers. So people interested in the conference and know a little bit more about that. One of the tests this week was on drug use, was on the cocaine use, was a questionnaire that was the ego dissolution inventory. And so I was looking at that, and it was on Wikipedia. They put that together with ego death, complete loss of subjective self-identity, and it actually mentioned the hero's journey. And part of the hero's journey is the withdrawal and being born again. And being born again requires dying. So the journey is based on the archetype death and rebirth, in which the false self is surrendered and the true self emerges. And for the scientific research, the ego disillusionment inventory, which is just a voluntary questionnaire that people are given to answer, either when they're on their drug experiment or afterwards, and questions about whether they feel lesser or more, or the the relation of ego, the dissolution of ego, feeling at one with the universe, feeling at union with others, decrease in the sense of self-importance, or the increase in the sense of self-importance, the disintegration of the self, less or more absorbed in issues and concerns, a loss of all of ego, self-identity going away. So that this could be related to pure meditation, but also to drug use, that specifically like LSD or something like that, that might cause the ego dissolution, as opposed to cocaine, which might cause an ego heightening. And it meant the connection between cocaine and sexual activity or violence, and but LSD, MDMA, that you could have a connection with that and the loss of ego. So that was an interesting paper today. And so the speaker today, Robin K.R. Harris, briefly talked about, this wasn't the main topic that he was talking about, but he had a paper on the entropic brain. So I'll just read a little bit. Entropy is a dimensionless quality that is used for measuring uncertainty about the state of a system, but it can also imply physical qualities where high entropy is synonymous with high disorder. Entropy is applied here in the context of state of consciousness and their associated neurodynamics, with a particular focus on the psychedelic state. The psychedelic state is considered an exemplar of a primitive or primary state of consciousness that preceded the development of modern adult human normal waking consciousness. Based on neuroimaging data with psilocybin, a classic psychedelic drug, it is argued that the defining feature of primary states is elevated entropy in certain aspects of brain function, such as the repertoire of functional connectivity motifs that form and fragment across time. Indeed, since there is greater repertoire of connectivity motifs in psychedelic state than in normal waking consciousness, this implies the primary states may exhibit critically the property of being poised at a critical point in the transition zone between order and disorder, where certain phenomena such as power law scaling appear. Moreover, in primary states are critical, then this suggests the entropy is suppressed in normal waking consciousness, meaning that the brain operates just below criticality. It is argued that this entropy suppression furnishes normal waking consciousness with a constrained quality of associated metacognitive function, including reality testing and self-awareness. It is also proposed the entry into primary states depends on a collapse of the normally highly organized activity within the default mode network and a decoupling between the default mode network and the medial temporal lobes, which are normally significantly coupled. These hypotheses can be tested by examining brain activity and associated cognition in other candidate primary states such as rapid eye movement, sleep, and early psychosis, and comparing those to non-primary states such as normal waking consciousness and the anesthetized state. So did you get anything out of that lecture? He didn't talk too much about his entropic brain theory. It was more about psychedelics, but it was interesting. And here you can see the the neural correlates of consciousness where they measure, and what does this mean? You have to know a lot about brain anatomy to be able to read these. But
I just think it's interesting that they're able to measure entropy. Wondering how they're doing that. It can't be a temperature thing, so it has to be something to do with the distribution, some sort of a pattern. So I'm curious about that. I guess they would just have to define a relative entropy between the states. So it doesn't even matter if they get the definition like dead on of what it could be. It's just, as long as it correlates more or less with the absolute loss of order relative to what it could be.
Yeah, we just talked, what does it mean for the brain to be self-organized and to measure that it would be more or less organized, and if it's in an induced state of psilocybin. Let me see what the psilocybin is a type of, it's a mushroom. So psilocybin is a psychedelic mushroom. So these would be states under psychedelic mushrooms. And if they're measuring a valence pre-post change and calling that entropy.
Well, really, you need probably at least 3, probably 5 spots to make sure you're actually parameterizing entropy correctly, but still it's on the right track, at least looking for the right type of thing. So this is good progress in my eyes.
Yeah, so it was interesting. I encourage people to take a look at that, and you could see like high entropy, high disorder, flexible states, and then low entropy, low disorder, rigid states. Like so low states of consciousness have low entropy, like a coma, anesthesia, sedation, deep sleep, depression, addiction. High entropy would be a psychedelic state, infant consciousness, REM, sleep dreaming, psychosis, near-death experience, magic thinking, dreaming state. So this interesting, so hopefully we'll come back more in the future to that. So I thought that was interesting. Oh, last night I didn't see Charles Moskowitz had Jay Dyer on, and so share that. So I have a few more things we could talk about. I'll just mention this real quick. Professor Hamerov mentioned this. I have actually, my dad just, it was in the books that my dad recently gave me, and it was the one that, as a kid, that I had read. My dad had this book on the shelf. He probably bought it near when it came out, which was Julian Jaynes' The Origins and Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. And he had an evolutionary hypothesis that consciousness evolved, and in the earlier states of man there was, so to say, no voice in the head, no consciousness, and the religious state, like the evolution of the voice in the head and consciousness and the creation of religion. And he talks about in the Iliad where he said there is no consciousness in the Iliad, and that consciousness was learned or evolved over time. So and it also talks about psychedelics. So I saw that Hammeroff had brought up the famous Julian Jaynes book in the program. And so did you have any slides or anything you wanted to share? So that was my review of the program today. So tomorrow, you will be Passover by night at like sundown here. I think the program ends earlier tomorrow. There's no night program, so the program ends at 7:00. There's no breakout sessions tomorrow. So if Jennifer wants to stream on her channel, I could join for like an hour and then start the holiday, and then we'll do week in review. So I'll leave that up to Jennifer if she wants to do tomorrow. So
yeah, that sounds like fun.
I had a few other things.
I wanted to still talk more about the debate there because I had a bunch of notes on it, but we can leave that to another time. The Chopra debate.
We can talk about it now. So I wanted to at least cover what happened today, and I had a little thoughts on mysticism, the scholarly approach to mysticism, more about interdisciplinary studies, and
yeah, me too.
But if you want to cover, you mean the debate last night, or do you have any notes on anything today that you wanted to share?
Well, I went over a few things. I forgot to mention the panpsychism argument reference to cosmic cogito, which I liked. They also referenced something called Hempel's dilemma. Have you heard of that?
I'm getting some weird noise on your end. Say it again, or spell it.
Sorry, I wanted to know if you'd heard of Hempel's dilemma.
I have to look it up. Hempel's dilemma.
Yeah, they didn't go into it, but they mentioned it on the show, and I'd never heard of it. It says that
the entire world can be described and explained using the law of nature. In other words, that all phenomena are natural phenomena. This leaves open the question of what is natural, but one common understanding of the claim is that everything in the world is ultimately explicable in terms of physics. This is known as reductive physicalism. However, this type of physicalism in its turn leaves open the question of what we are to consider as the proper terms of physics. There seems to be two options here, and these options form the horns of Hempel's dilemma because neither seems satisfactory. On the one hand, we may define the physical as whatever is currently explained by our best physical theories. Though many would find this definition unsatisfactory, some would accept that we have at least a general understanding of the physical base of these theories and can use them to assess what is physical and what is not. And therein lies the rub, as a worked out explanation of mentality currently lies outside the scope of physics. On the other hand, if we say in some future ideal physics is what we meant, then the claim is rather empty, for we have no idea what this means. The ideal physics may even come to define what we think of as mental as part of the physical world. In effect, physicalism, by the second account, becomes the circular claim that all phenomena are explicable in terms of physics, because physics properly defined is whatever explains all phenomena.
Yeah, a lot of people just really cannot get this notion of self-referentiality being not any type of conclusion into their understanding. So, it's just, I'll give an example, like in the chat. they're talking about entanglement, and I just made a comment like, I want to set people up for pedagogical success. I don't want any unrealistic expectations. Yeah, some of the stuff's not that easy, but once you can see where it's intuitive and you can grasp the intuitions, a lot easier to apply the quote logic, big tent logic there. So I say entanglement is definitely a thing. It's just not well understood at this time, and it's possible we have identified different words like superposition and even statistical distribution. There's actually a common thread there, and that was something that got mentioned as well, which I was happy to hear. And some person's like, well, love is entanglement or something like that, and then it turns into like a nitpick fest about whether a metaphor is a metaphor. And so it's like I said, it's not a metaphor. It is actually literally that. Oh, well, everything's a metaphor. That was the response. It's like, now I get it that language is a metaphor. That wasn't your point, and you're just like backing down. It's like, okay, if people's attitude is that being wrong is somehow bad, you're going to have a really bad time studying this stuff. So, yeah. Hempel's dilemma appears to be leading up to physicalism, which is the metaphysical thesis that the laws of physics exhaustively describe causality. That is extremely silly and definitely not established by any way. But I'm pretty impressed with how far panpsychism has gotten. It seems like the people who do accept it seem very comfortable with it, and maybe it's one of those things where there's a steep learning curve at first, and then it's more comfortable. Because it certainly doesn't mean, anything.
Yeah, they had a breakout session on panpsychism that I didn't go to. I'll watch the video when they release it. It's kind of like the ether and, Michelson Morley, in that panpsychism explains a phenomenon by positing another unexplainable phenomenon. And, so if you take a religious approach, you say, okay, well, this unexplainable phenomenon is positive by our...
It's non-trivial self-reference. It's a little bit stronger, even in its non-developed form, than the alternative, which is basically pure meaninglessness. But please go ahead.
Yeah, that I was saying, okay, I accept this concept because it's taught to me in my religion or my sages, versus a logical kind of like passing the buck on the hard problem of consciousness is, like I was saying last night, that at some point they have to give up on the brain producing consciousness that like I told, argued against T-Jump. They've had decades, and if the brain produces consciousness, you've had a long time to figure it out, and at some point you say, yeah, actually the experiments and the evidence are more likely to show the brain doesn't produce consciousness, and then we have the problem of, like, what is consciousness, where does it come from? And so if I argue that for like a proof of God or against atheism, but if you're going to posit, well, how does it work? Just like Charles, well, God, but we want a mechanism, we want something scientific that could be tested, and that's why I said, like, the neural correlates of consciousness could be considered the neural correlates of the soul or the spiritual realm. If you look at the brain as a receiver, and like, why are things lighting up in the brain? Because the brain is interacting with this other realm, and then you're looking at this substance that the brain is interacting with. And if you want to say that it is consciousness, or consciousness is just a word. So
consider it like this: what is the best way to define consciousness to further understanding? And that's where I picked my definitions from, is like, that would actually be correct. The science definition shouldn't match up with the subjective definition. And this way it does. But yeah, did you want to go on talking, like I sort of segued, are we at interdisciplinary studies now? Because I did have an opinion on that.
Yeah, just to look quickly here, and randomly, Robert Flood, who was also brought down The Art of Memory and had written about memory techniques. You could look at kind of like Jennifer's diagrams, somewhat like mnemonics and memory techniques in the tradition of people like Bruno and Flood, and in like the method of Loki, or not like necessarily the method of Loki, but in a Platonic sense, where you're saying that there's some sort of dualistic reality to the nature of the structure of information, and so just what does the word consciousness mean? If you look at the etymology,
I think that way of wording it is very confusing. You said there's a dualistic thing to information. I don't know that that's the best way to describe consciousness. Isn't consciousness more about?
Well, I was just mentioning the picture here that they had of this man, Robert Flood, of consciousness in a dualistic sense, where you're having like a dialogue box, but this dialogue box isn't a physical thing. It's representative of like Platonic forms or dualistic. So just saying, historically, thinkers on consciousness were dualistic. The word itself means skio, to know together, and possibly originally meant when it was first used like joint attention, that consciousness meaning that what is in my head is parallel to what is in someone else's head.
With
in the Latin, and that's what it meant. It would have been dualistic, in that the reason why what's in my head is the same as what's in someone else's head is because it's not really in my head, it's in this other place, and me and the other person are tapping into the same form that's in this other place. And that's was generally the Platonic understanding. And you had Aristotle had a different word. He didn't use the word consciousness. John Locke is generally the modern father of
it just wouldn't translate, because they would have all been panpsychists of some sort.
Well, I'm using the word dualist. That when you say panpsychism, to me,
panpsychism is non-dualism. So if you're saying, to me, I think of dualism as like there's at least 10 different types of dualism that I use. So I don't know. I've tried to hear you out on what that means, but it's hard because I don't know that we conceive of any of these abstract spiritual concepts in a similar way.
Because you just haven't studied, studied the classics. So I was saying, like dualism, if you're saying, if you study the classics and you're saying how the people in the classics framed it, you'd be comfortable with the expression dualism. So I know you have your understanding, and I'm glad that you have your understanding. But for anyone who's academic and wants to know the classics, like we want to know what the great minds of previous generations thought, and we don't want to filter that through your understanding. We want to understand them on their own of what they proposed. And so just straight up, I don't care if you disagree with dualism. Dualism is a known phenomenon.
It's not that I disagree with the Doooovid. I'm saying the definitions of many of the words that define the term have changed, so it's very difficult. Not denying anything of what you said is accurate.
Yes, so just saying that if you're talking about some separate realm, dualism, that there's two realms.
And that's, to me, not enough information. Like, what do you mean by realm? Do you mean like a realm, like
we went over this many times,
realm, or a spiritual, like, is there spirits in this realm?
We went over this countless times, but it's saying that there's different understandings.
Yeah, I'm asking what they mean by dualism. What is it when you're saying dualism? You're saying that there's a God on the other side judging, that there's spirits on the other side judging? Because to me, just dualism just means that there's some sort of fundamental divide. It's not enough to say, well, there's dualism. It's like, well, how is it dual exactly?
What it means, there's a material realm and there's another realm. And if you want to call that spiritual, like in a Kabbalistic sense, you might call it the spiritual realm. In a Platonic sense, you could call it the realm of forms or the realm of ideas, depending on, there is no they. There's multiple theories. We're saying you have the physical realm, you have the body, mind-body dualism. Mind is not a subject of matter. Mind does not arise from matter. Mind is not a product of matter. Mind is a product of another non-physical realm, hence dualism. And so what's the nature of that other realm? There's a lot of schools of dualism, but the main point is mind is part of this other dualistic realm, and it's not matter. And so if you're using terms like consciousness or psychism,
Okay, I got it.
that
Yeah,
that you're saying whatever psychism or consciousness is, it's not part of the physical material realm. It's part of this other realm.
Okay, I see where the confusion is. Thanks for clearing that up.
Okay, I mean, it's your confusion. And
Yeah,
saying,
I know. It was my confusion, and you cleared it up, so thanks.
and saying this, you're saying, so when you use the term dualism, you could cast a large school that includes the majority of the classics, the majority of the Western canon, the Eastern canon, of the greatest minds of previous generations that had a mind-body dichotomy, and the body being material and the mind being the other realm that is much harder to describe, although they give descriptions of it. And so the attempt now with the science of consciousness, the neural correlates of consciousness, is you could look at like as the interaction problem. And so Doooovid as a dualist is saying whatever this mind consciousness thing is, it's not physical. And saying that there's a me, and there's me thinking, there's me being conscious, and there's a me that controls this body, but that is not physical. It's not part of the material realm, but it interacts with the material realm. So the neural correlates of consciousness are specifically related to the interaction between the two realms, which is not the general direction of the research, because they're opposing there's only one realm, and that's the material realm, and consciousness is a material function of the material realm, and that's their burden to explain. And say if you're a dualist, that's also but just the history of the term consciousness is making comes Locke define consciousness, the perception of what passes over man's own mind, that consciousness is related to the function of the mind. And what are the functions of the mind, if you want to call like intelligence, or the controller, or thought, or feeling, or emotions, or any of these things that might have neural correlates. But consciousness is simply related to the mind, and it came into the Western canon that is specifically related to consciousness is the purview, the function of the mind. And what does that mean? That I like Descartes, cogito ergo sum, or what does it mean to think? What does it mean to process? What does it mean to have free will? What does it mean to be the controller of my body? That's the purview of consciousness. And just because in the classic sense they were dualist, and whatever this thing that we're referring to as consciousness is not a product of the material realm. In modern science, the consensus opinion is that it is a product of the material realm, but it's still a description of the same phenomenon that people described, even though they attribute it. So if I'm a dualist and I attribute this thing that we're both familiar with to a non-physical realm, and you attribute it to a physical realm, we're still talking about the same thing, even if it's something like intelligence, thought, controller, will, emotion, that we could agree, like the color red, we could agree blue or something that this is what the phenomenon is, even though we disagree on the nature of the phenomenon. So I just put it out there that it's the science of
I think we can agree to the extent that we're referring to the same thing when we say blue, and that we can have verification outside of our own senses, aka a range of frequencies associated with blue. So that's fine. Past that, yeah, it's basically nothing but problems on the level of interpretation. Not you, but other, like just all the theories we're looking at. There's what is the perception of blue and things like that. I don't think people perceive colors the same, because the perception is informed.
Let's go back to the word skio, to know together.
Sure.
That's saying that when I say something, that I mean the same thing that you say. And that's
Yeah.
the literal definition of consciousness, that what I'm referring to is the same thing that you're referring to. And if we mean the science of consciousness, we're talking about something, universal humanism, whatever this thing is that I think is me or is happening in my mind. We could know together that there's some, so that's in the definition of the word itself.
I wasn't going by a technical definition. I was going by what people refer to when they say it, which I know you probably think is unknowable, but ultimately it's a process relation. So it's a question of how many different concepts do you need to differentiate in order for what you're saying about the mind to make sense. Like, does it make sense to differentiate a thought from a mind? Why does that distinction need to happen?
People want to know what consciousness is, but saying what consciousness does. And so
what consciousness is what it does. And learning about consciousness makes you understand how all definitions are process relational, even the ones that seem like they're not. But anyway.
Well, no, I mean, saying that generally that's not the way Locke or the Western canon lays it out, and that we don't know what consciousness is, but we do know what it does. And now you might even disagree on what it does, but...
Well, we've done some measurements of part of its action mechanism, absolutely, and we have a very strong understanding of its physical correlates.
Yeah, and that's why we, all these studies today. But I just wanted to go over the terminology, and even Wikipedia
and just to say, in French, conscience doesn't mean consciousness, it means conscience. So there's definitely been change in definitions of these words, at least, common understanding throughout the years.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that, like, moral consciousness, conscientia, but it still has the, French, it's still the Latin etymology of knowing together.
I'm not denying that. I'm just saying, like, I speak French, and conscience is conscience. Conscient de something is being aware of something, yes, but the word for conscious is very similar, if not identical. So there's a question of how words are understood, and it's through sounds. And when words sound really similar, there's a very high risk of confusion processed relationally where they overlap. So I don't know if you understand what I mean when I say you need three concepts for the process relation of consciousness. I don't think I've ever managed to get any of that across successfully. What about the notion of you need products, a mediator, and reactants in order to do any experiment? The Trinitarian causal decomposition?
I mean, I guess so. That I mean, you could possibly.
So you can see the argument is a structural argument.
That's necessary saying that scientific method. Maybe you could
think of it like this: like chemistry, stoichiometry would be incoherent if we couldn't conceive of it as reactants, change, products. So reactants, mediator, products, that's your absolute simplest breakdown of a state transition. You start with something, there's photons that mediate the exchange, and then you end with something else.
Yeah, that's basically all these experiments. Like,
so the argument is that type of level. It's a metaphysical argument of saying you need at least three concepts in order to resolve the phenomenon of consciousness. So that's why I said mind, self, and conscious, as in the process relation of consciousness, the like waveform kind of pumping up and down as the basic arc of consciousness. But yeah, ultimately, every consciousness definition is going to have some problems. So you do need to have a couple definitions of consciousness and run them simultaneously to sort of iron out any possible errors. dealing in consciousness is always difficult. Benefit of it is, though, the errors in other domains, they're just not there. If you don't face the consciousness problems, then the domain errors, you don't know where they're going to come up. If you face consciousness head on, it's going to be a lot of challenging concepts and stuff, but you will not miss as many possible errors. So there's my little pitch there for, I guess it's panpsychism. But yeah, for interdisciplinary studies, I definitely had thoughts about that if we're talking about consciousness. But I don't know if my argument made any sense, but hopefully it sinks in at some point. Did you understand about the Trinity thing, that you need a certain number of different concepts to resolve a process?
Yeah, that would be the basic of all these, like the binaural beats, where you have the brain, the beats, and then the measured state of the difference in the brain after the added state, or the psychedelics, where if you wanted to divide it all into 3 parts, where you have the what's being tested, what's being done to what's being tested, and the measurement of the change of the state of what's being tested. So all of these experiments, all of these papers today basically had that, whether it was psychedelics or shamanic practices or meditation or binaural beats, anesthesics, near death, that there, it was an altered state. Although, from in terms of the scientific method, we could save that discussion for a different time, whether that's
if the universe is fundamentally only consciousness and there's nothing but consciousness, it's a question of what does it mean to calibrate various effects of consciousness known to be illusory. So
I mean, to me, that's unnecessary. You're saying that if you're saying, like, because I'm a dualist, and then to just say that, so if you're taking a monistic approach and you're saying there's only one substance and the material arises from the one substance of consciousness, and then this substance that doesn't arise from the material is consciousness, and that's why we have consciousness, because it's this primordial monistic substance that gave rise to the material. But I would take more a dualistic perspective, and so I wouldn't be panpsychist in that. I'm not anti-panpsychist, but saying consciousness or panpsychism is just one aspect of dualism. So it's saying that the spiritual realm is not necessarily consciousness.
Probably, I would honestly probably agree with you on that.
Function of the spiritual realm. And so if you just say the spiritual realm is consciousness, I think that's unnecessary.
I literally didn't mean that. I'm saying the material realm is consciousness. I haven't even spoken on the spiritual realm. I'm saying the material realm, fundamentally, the process relation of matter is consciousness.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, I hear that you're saying that, and I mean, there's some theories, but that's not my understanding, and certainly.
Well, there's different schools of panpsychism. There's tons of dualism.
I did my diagram for Ben Watkins, and trying to explain dualism and monism, and if you're talking what's the origin of the material realm, if the spiritual realm gives rise to the material realm, or if you have a deistic understanding where there's a deity that gives rise to both the material and spiritual realm, or you could have a progression where the deity gives rise to the spiritual realm, then in that spiritual realm, or gives rise to consciousness, and consciousness gives rise to the material realm, or you could have a direct that the deity gives rise to directly to the material realm and directly to the spiritual realm. So if so you're making a specific religious school when you claim that consciousness gives rise to the material realm, that is not necessarily something.
That's not what I said, though. I said the material realm, the fundamental process of matter is consciousness, aka waveform collapse or reduction.
Well, and then you're changing. If you're defining,
I'm changing it so that the definition accords with the Copenhagen.
Yeah, but you're changing. You're saying that consciousness is the waveform reduction, and you're defining that
It's a
as what
process.
consciousness is.
Yeah.
And that's not what I'm saying. That it's in consciousness something different than that. And
Sure.
and then if you're claiming that the origin of the material realm is the collapse of the waveform function, and that
Yeah.
that collapse is consciousness, that that could
All I'm
be
saying is all state transitions are waveform reductions. That's what I'm saying. And I'm saying an amplification is a form of reduction because it's just the reflection. Because you're looking at something that's essentially modeled as a sphere. So if it gets depressed, it's going to sort of balloon out elsewhere. So an reduction always comes with an amplification. I made a
Yeah, but I mean,
gift
I
of
understand
that.
what you're saying, but and saying you could advance your theories, and encourage you to, but you're just for the metaphysics here, is that you're saying something that requires higher order rules, such as mathematics.
How do you know that?
Because you're saying that there's a phenomenon of the waveform collapse reduction, which if you're saying it's mathematical or it's a higher order rule, and what's the origin of this higher order rule of the waveform reduction, if you want to say that is.
Well, I don't want to talk about that because that's the stuff that's going to incense people. So why go into the topics known to incense people? Just focus on the secular science and not worry about the theological stuff. And if you
Well,
want to
it's not
see an
incensing me. I'm
example,
just making a point in metaphysics that
screen share.
I'm just framing metaphysically what you're saying, and why what you're saying, that there's more uncertainty, and that what you're saying is just one of many possible options, and that there's a whole host of explanations or hierarchies, and you're specifically saying something is just one of many possible hierarchies, and that what you're
Sure.
saying necessitates higher order rules. And then the question of what's the origin
I have
of
not
those
introduced
higher
higher
order
order
rules.
rules at this point. I'm sorry, I haven't introduced any rules at this
Well, you
point,
did
so I don't
the
know what you're talking about.
waveform collapse is a higher order rule.
All right.
And
All
then you
right.
say, what's the origin of that higher order rule of the waveform collapse?
Material observations. I'm looking at science from the last 1 to 200 years, and the understanding is a
I'm talking
wave
about the
function
metaphysical frame. I'm
collapse.
not talking about the history of ideas. So he's saying that if there's some sort of phenomenon that we call the waveform collapse, that's a higher order rule. So it's like the cosmological argument.
All right,
What,
conservation of
what's
energy.
the origin of
Conservation of
higher order
energy.
rule?
Conservation of energy.
And saying that's still a higher order rule. And then the question, what's the
Conservation
origin
of energy is a higher order principle, but it's well established in the material realm, and that's what I'm trying to do. So it's all good.
Irrelevant. I'm not saying it's irrelevant, but from the metaphysical framing, there's still a precursor to that higher order rule. So even say that higher order rule exists in the material realm, and we're in the material realm, and we know that that's a reality, doesn't change the question of what's the origin of that higher order rule. And you say, well, we don't know. We know that it exists, and it's constant or it's absolute, if you want to posit that, but it's still not an answer to what's the origin of these higher order rules. And if there's an origin to the higher order rule, are there even higher order rules above this higher order rule?
Yeah, you can look at it that way if you want. I don't know how it got
This is
onto that
metaphysics.
topic.
It's not like look at it.
Well, you're just trying to do infinite regression, and the point of
It's just pure
metaphysics is to end
metaphysics here.
infinite regress, not to begin it.
So I'm just talking pure metaphysics here, and it's, it's kind of the constant problem I have with Jennifer. I'm trying to lay out something abstract, and she's trying to advance her own theory, and so I'm just framing her theory in an abstract realm of metaphysical possibilities, and I'm not sure if she's trying to argue that her theory is the only possible solution, or even what the point of what she's saying. If she's just accepting, yes, I see your metaphysical framing of what I'm trying to say, or you're trying to like pretend like what you're saying is more profound than it actually is.
Let me think here. You've got consciousness up on the screen there. I'm just trying to get it to the point where we both understand that it's about the definition that matters. And I thought you wanted me to talk about my definition that I was using, but I don't have to. I just don't think any of these other definitions are going to actually give any information that we're after. because who knows how to define consciousness? If it's a chicken and egg thing. If you don't know what it is, how do you know how to define it? If you can't define it, how can you figure out what it is? So I'm sorry I've not been better focused on what this conversation is supposed to be about. I thought we're trying to forward an interdisciplinary understanding of an extremely obscure topic.
Yeah, so I mean, if you have the tendency to frame your understanding or advance your understanding as opposed to, I'm just trying to frame an understanding or the topic at hand. I'm not advancing my own understanding. I'm just advancing an understanding of the topic at hand. And you're saying that my own understanding on it is irrelevant to the topic at hand. That, save when or I can mention, okay, here's my leanings on the issue, or save that for a different time. But it appears you always go back to pushing your understanding, and it becomes argumentative, because then, because if you take it like I'm arguing against your understanding, as opposed to I'm framing your understanding as just one possible explanation of the phenomenon, and then framing what you're saying in terms of the larger issue and the recognition of the uncertainty.
Yeah, sorry about that.
And that's why all these conversations lead into circles, because it's not supposed to be confrontational. And if you take it as confrontational, it's because like if I'm reading it because you're you're just thinking that you're like exclusivist, that like, no, my understanding is the understanding, and you will not frame my understanding because my understanding is the understanding. And so
no, I don't feel like that, and I'm sorry if that I seemed that was how I felt. So that's,
and then we have to go back to all the, because then
different bedside
then
manner.
we have to repeat all these metaphysical groundings, or you're saying like, yes, there's uncertainty. There's the words prescriptive, not descriptive, not prescriptive, and that's why I have the multiple truth hypothesis, and just saying there's a lot of uncertainty, and I'm just trying to lay out what does dualism mean, and the schools of dualism, and then so if you're trying to like disprove something, I'm not trying to prove. I'm not even trying to advance something to prove.
I wasn't trying to disprove it. I was trying to understand why you're calling it dualism, because to me, what you're describing is the same thing as what I'm describing. And I call it non-dualism, and you're calling it dualism, and I'm trying to figure out what you mean by dualism. But you're saying you're just doing a broad-scale analysis of different schools of dualism.
Yeah, I mean, that's why when you say, if you're describing something as non-dualism, that's you advancing your own understanding. And so here you are, like, all these people are wrong. And so like I'm giving a classical framing of the masters of the Western tradition, or even Eastern Kabbalistic traditions, and that specifically used the terminology dualism. And so like it seems just kind of petty that you always want to argue with that, and just say like, okay, you have your understanding. I know you have your understanding. You don't have to try to advance your understanding. Every time I mention Plato, you don't have to argue with Plato. You just say, let Doooovid explain what the classic great minds laid out on the subject, and it doesn't have to be in relation to your ideas. And then you think you have some sort of theory of everything, and then therefore, and if you so that's the nature of mind, where you want to filter everything through your own understanding. I mean, it could be that's just the way the mind works. So the Talmud says you have to study under one master for 7 years, and after that, you could study under other masters, and even in 1 year learn new systems. But if you till you have one system in your head, you have to filter everything through that one system. And then once you have one system in your head, then you can have multiple systems in your head, and you don't have to filter everything through that one system, and you could hold multiple conflicting ideas in your head at the same time. So that's what Doooovid is trying to get at. That's the heart of the multiple truth hypothesis. And it's good that you have a system, like that you've thought about it, you have a system. But like, I mean, generally, like, you don't argue with the sages, that they had a view, and you should understand their view as is. And you're coming down to, like,
You're
every
saying it's possible to understand views as is.
well, that should be the goal, as opposed to,
Right.
what
And
would
how
would
do we
appear
know
to
we've
be that
understood a view as it is
you seem to
versus some
argue,
other way?
you
It's
seem to
very
argue
hard.
with all of them and say, like, well, my understanding is better than theirs, and or at least that's the way it comes across to me, as opposed to, saying, like, no, I mean, that if you become a scholar, that the sages, and what they say, and the differences in what they say, and the larger uncertainty of the issues, and why there's disagreement among the sages.
Well, we're talking about consciousness here, and now you switch to sages. So what sages do you mean here? Because I don't want it to become a theological debate. The whole point of giving the consciousness defined materialistically was to avoid it becoming a theological, irresolvable debate.
Well, I'm saying it's sages of the Western tradition. You're talking about, like, I mean, just here on Wikipedia. So, you have,
Like, you're going to tell me John Locke is a sage?
yeah, for this sake, yes, I'm saying John Locke's
Okay.
a sage of the Western
Well,
tradition.
I just wanted to make sure I knew what
and,
you meant by sage.
and it's saying, like, when you argue with John Locke, to me, it just makes you sound stupid. It doesn't make John Locke sound stupid. And, like, you might insist on arguing with John Locke, and he's like, he's not really a sage, but it's saying, like, no, I'll understand John Locke as is, and there could be, to say, what did Locke think, and you might have a different understanding, or there might be more to know now, but saying the canonized sages of the Western tradition, that it's saying even the words that we're using, saying that we're saying was a sage of the Western tradition, that we use his terminology, that even you yourself, when you speak about these phenomenons, you use the lexicon that he created. That's so say why they're the sages of the Western tradition, and people are uneducated enough, they don't even know that they're using the lexicon that was created by these sages. And even the terminology become problematic, because you're going to call someone a sage. Those are almost fighting words, because people are ready to leave their body, their fight to the death over their sages, and conflicts among the sages, as opposed to just understanding ideas.
Well, he doesn't have a following that is, I mean, to me, a sage kind of
We're
has
his
to
following
have
because we're using the lexicon that he created.
Doesn't make
The Science of Consciousness Conference. Consciousness is his word. The whole thing that we're
do you think
talking
anyone
about
would agree with
is,
you that John Locke is a sage?
sage is just a word, but it's saying that if someone's educated, they would know that he created the lexicon that we're using to discuss this issue. If you don't want to classify that as a sage, you could use a different word, but that's just
fine. I mean, I just want to make sure I'm following what you're saying here, because, yeah, I just want, like, in my mind, my understanding of physics, I agree with like 99.9% of physics. It's just a tiny tweak in my mind that I'm doing, just one little tweak. But
I mean, you have to
get it.
use
It doesn't go
words.
across that way.
You have to use words to express your ideas, and then
I mean, to my understanding, I am using words. I'm just not using the right words. That's not gripping onto anything you already understand. That's the problem.
Well, yeah, there's the sages. So, like John Locke, so use the lexicon that he created, like Plato and Aristotle.
Did he help people understand about consciousness, though? He maybe made the word, or I don't know, but did he actually get forward an understanding of consciousness?
Well, yeah, I'm saying that probably still till today, that that's probably,
we don't have an understanding of consciousness today. That's the whole point.
Well, yeah, that I'm saying the best that we have, and even the lexicon to even talk about whatever this phenomenon that we're trying to describe, is, we're limited to our sages. So you could start from scratch without even a vocabulary or a basis of communication to express these ideas, but you come on to the previous sages who already codified this stuff and created lexicons, and then just like the material reality that we live in, the fact that there's language and there's an understand lexicon and shared ideas like conscience, knowing together that you're saying we both have a lexicon and a concept, and then if you look to the origin of it, it's okay. It's this guy John Locke that this is that we're able to communicate this idea because we're using ideas that were codified by this person.
Did you want to maybe read the problem of definition? Just notice that's at the bottom there. That seems like it might be interesting. Or maybe just a bit of it.
Yeah, but this is just Wikipedia. Like I've been saying, I could read these articles all day. I was trying to frame it, and
right. You want me to do something with John Locke?
Well, I'm telling you, already are. You're using his lexicon, whether you know it or not. So I mean, if you could besmirch your own sages, so to say, and you don't even know that he's your sage, you don't even know that you're using his lexicon. And I mean, that's fine, but you're saying there's a, so to say,
did I learn what I know about consciousness in this life, though? And do I owe my own knowledge that I know from my past lives to someone in this life I learned nothing from, except a word? So it's a kind of a question of...
Yeah, I mean, presumably it's like, yeah, I mean, you have to say the origin of the idea, but...
yeah, so I'm not going to say the origin of my ideas on consciousness is John Locke, though. And consciousness is just a word I picked up for an understanding I have that goes so far beyond words. It doesn't even have any words in it at all. Just a process, not even a process.
You're limited that when you want to, I mean, you could just have your fantasies in your own mind about your great understanding. Mm-hmm. But when you have to speak to people, you have to use a lexicon and a common lexicon. And, so you're limited to what's available and, that, and then you come on to
there's actually too many words as it is, so I'm trying to use only a subset of the number of words that are available, but that's fine. We don't have to talk about that. We can go on to interdisciplinary studies and what type of knowledge someone would need to lead an interdisciplinary study on consciousness, like an expertise. Like, what would justify an expertise on consciousness? Just such a mystery. Oh, scholarly approaches to mysticism. Good timing. Was that related to the conference?
Yeah. And I mean, people mentioned William James, and they're talking about, the shamanism or mysticism, or just the approach to the mystical experience, and then even, I mean, it seems so time consuming, like every time to argue about these definition of these words and this common lexicon, and then this concept that you think you have this like great understanding in your own head that you can't express, and then you have to come on to these words, and you don't have your own lexicon even. So
you're saying it would be better if I invented words no one had ever heard of than attempt to use the words that are already in circulation?
It just seems annoyingly time consuming to have the dumb word games that really just slow down progress. There's so much.
Well, isn't every philosophical question a word game?
Possibly.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, everything has to do with solving this word game that's impossible at first. And one of the first things you have to do is get on the same page with regards to what you mean. And that means adopting a shared jargon. And that means understanding that, number one, there's limitations on language. And number two, that the purpose of what we're doing is to not have as many of those limitations as normal, is to minimize the limitations of language by maximizing the precisional accuracy of what
I knew what John Locke meant before I had this conversation with you. I still don't understand what you mean. And so I'm not sure.
What exactly are you expecting in terms of an understanding? I don't understand what you mean when you say you don't understand what you mean and why you think that matters.
Well, I didn't gain anything from this back and forth. I'm not sure if anyone watching this gained anything from that. I want to avoid, going in these circles again and again, because I think it's just a waste of time.
It's really hard to know when it isn't a circle, because I just made an argument that you need a shared lexicon. Are you denying that?
Well, and that's what I just said. I mean, if you just repeated
what I'm trying to do.
Own.
By going through the definitions, I'm trying to get to a shared lexicon. So if you don't want, I mean, it's like, okay, I don't get it. That's why I guess I just need to learn to communicate better.
Yeah, or just if you're having a problem communicating, like, we don't need to waste a bunch of time on these silly arguments about words. Especially
literally
when you can't advance your own. I mean, really, it's like you're not educated in the philosophy. You don't know the terminology, and it's like, so just learn it, or I'm not sure, but can
you learn definitions of words that aren't defined? Is it possible to do that?
Well, possibly. It's like these words are well defined, and saying like it appears that you're the only one who doesn't understand them. I mean, maybe most people don't. They're complicated. Not saying you're the only one. I mean, it's probably, saying that not many people are interested in these fields, and even you yourself are only minorly interested in these fields. Like you're more interested.
I'm extremely interested in the field. To me, I've gone so far from my original understanding that this is like getting as close to these ideas as I can. You're like, you're too far from the ideas. It's like, okay, well, I'm not sure how to get closer, but I'll work on it.
Yeah, you have to do homework. You have to study.
You're saying go find the understanding of consciousness as someone who didn't understand consciousness. It's like he didn't understand it. Because if he did, we would.
Yeah, I mean, so now you're going back to this like Hempel's dilemma. It's still unknown. So, like, of course, like it's still unknown. Like he advanced the understanding enough to be in the sages that we use his own lexicon, but like, no, it's still unknown. He didn't solve the hard problem of consciousness. There's still not a concrete, definitive understanding. But among the best of the understanding that working with that we're using, it's it's locks. It's from these sages. That's why they've been canonized in the tradition of the sages. That's why their books are the ones that are taught and read. That's why even you use their very terminology, whether you like him or not.
I actually feel wonderful about it, and I guess I just not good enough in communication yet. I guess I feel like there has to be an indirect route to learning. Otherwise, I'm basically tricking you into agreeing with me in a hypnotic sense. So I sort of avoid that line of discussion.
Yeah, but you haven't even said anything that's sensical for me to agree with. So just like the only thing I could agree with is just to move on the conversation. Just like, okay, I agree, let's move it on, because you didn't make any sense to me. And like it just appeared that you were arguing over the meaning of a word, and I'm pretty sure I knew what the word meant before I started arguing about it, and I still have the same understanding of the word. And all we did.
You're pretty sure you knew what the word meant, even though words don't have meanings. They only have process relations. You're pretty sure you knew what the word meant, and you're not sure that was just an impression.
Now you're going back to some stupid word game and saying like, okay, yes, you could get to some deeper understanding of the meaning of various things, but we don't have to do that for every single conversation, and then it's dumb.
But that's the point of the conversation, is a deeper understanding of consciousness.
But you're not creating. You're just having the same repetitive conversations about so to say, the existential or the empirical problems. And so, like, we frame these issues like so every single time it's a definition that you have to repeat these empirical problems of empiricism, and it's it just seems like time wasting. It seems unproductive.
Okay, then, dude, you want to say anything about interdisciplinary studies and how to do that?
Yeah, but I don't want to argue over words every time. Like if you have a problem,
please don't take it as arguing. Take it as furthering the discussion and getting closer to a better understanding. Like, to me, it's necessary, and
but
it's,
I don't think you are. Like I'm not. I don't think you are. So it's unfortunate. So yeah, I mean, scholarly approaches to mysticism, and here just a definition, with the problems of what a definite mysticism, popularly known as becoming one with God or the absolute, refer to any kind of ecstasy or altered state of consciousness which is given a religious or spiritual meaning.
Yep.
I mean, it's kind of like these B-rate tier debates, like even modern day debate, politically provoked T-jump, where they can't agree on definitions, and then the debate goes nowhere, and
To me, this is actually a
then
really
it
good
goes back
conversation.
to arguing over definitions, and to some extent, like, no, we have to agree enough on definitions to have a conversation, or else, like, there's no point to the conversation.
Fine, I agree with all the definitions you gave for all the scholars. I don't contest any of the definitions you gave. I just contest that there is a unified understanding. There is a big umbrella,
I know that you
big
don't have to
dense
say that
understanding of
every time I
consciousness.
give a definition. So that's what you do. You repeat. I know that you've said that every single time for a few years now, and you waste 30 minutes of my time every single time I give a definition, and it doesn't help for the given definition. It's just a repetitive, dumb argument that isn't advancing everything, because it's a repeat of the same argument you make every single time I give a definition. So his approaches to mysticism. Zayer distinguished between three fundamental types of mysticism: theistic, monistic, and panehenic, or natural mysticism. The theistic category, here's, we don't talk, I'll avoid talking about mysticism now, and because it's just going to be a bunch of definitions, and I don't want to argue about definitions or then.
I would say mysticism is more about what is accepted as a valid way of imparting said mysticism, less so about definitions in the same sense that some of these conversations go with consciousness. I'd say mysticism is a little different, but we don't have to go into that.
Just interdisciplinary studies, the combination of two or more academic disciplines into one activity, draws knowledges from several fields. In this case, consciousness, like chemistry, physics, biology, philosophy, theology, neurology, creating something by thinking across boundaries. Term interdisciplinary is applied when education and training pedagogies to describe studies that use methods and insights of several established disciplines or traditional fields of study. Interdisciplinary involves researchers, students, and teachers, and the goal of connecting and integrating several academic schools of thought. The adjective interdisciplinary is most often used in educational circles when researchers from two or more disciplines pool their approaches and modify them so that they're better suited to the problem at hand, including the case of the team-taught course where students are required to understand some of the interdisciplinary are 20th century terms. They have a precursor in Greek philosophy, Greek drama, barriers. So there's not too much interesting on Wikipedia. I didn't prepare something to show interdisciplinary, just the difficulty of, and then you get this definition problem because words mean different
There's
things.
also a problem of whose expertise trumps the other. And when you have multiple disciplines, sometimes it's going to be one person's expertise that trumps the other, and then other times it's going to be another person. So deciding the range of expertise is a big deal as well. I'd say the definitions are just as much of a problem as that. But the practice we have dealing with the definitions so far, probably Just put a positive spin on it, it's actually going to go a long way, I think. Because the more times you can see the thing come up with it again, makes it more self-evident.
Yeah, so I mean, you could say like, okay, terms mean slightly different things in different fields or to different people, but like consciousness to know together, some extent of the meaning is conveyed. If you want to take like a multiple truth hypothesis, truth discovery function, what percent of the meaning is conveyed, or if you could mathematize some sort of equity, between 0 and 1 of the overlap of the meaning from one discipline to the next. That if you had like energy and from physics to chemistry or any scientific concept, is the definition transfer purely, or is there element of it? And then just conversationally of how much of the meaning has transferred to the other person. And then obviously expertise would be like a weighting factor. So you're just talking the pure communication across disciplines where words mean different things in different disciplines, possibly due to different focus or axioms that if you want to mathematize in some sort of truth discovery function, they might have a different weighting, like from biology to chemistry to physics, that the fundamental axioms may not differ, but there might be different weighting that would cause the definitions to slightly differ, even in terms of like questions like what is matter, for like chemistry to physics to biology. And in biology, maybe the question what is matter is accepted as an axiom. And so biology works with the fundamental acceptance of matter, even though the reality is that that might be an uncertainty. And so you're talking pure scientific interdisciplinary study and the difficulties of that versus something like cross disciplines like theology and philosophy to the sciences. And that's where I keep on bringing dualism, because if you're talking philosophy and theology, dualism is a well understood concept. And then maybe if you're talking physics, you're going to reject dualism, possibly, and just say that's false, it's not true. There's no possibility for dualism within physics. Or if you have an understanding of physics that is non-dualistic, then there might not be the possibility of interdisciplinary studies between dualistic philosophy or theology and non-dualistic science, although it's possible that there still could be interplay of or building a greater truth from something, even though it has such a fundamental contradiction, such as dualistic theology and philosophy to non-dualistic science. So the science of consciousness, you have to recognize even the terminologies that we use, the very words that we're using. So if you're trying to talk about the science of consciousness, but you're using philosophical and theological terms, so it's it's almost contradictory, like I would say anachronistic, that most of the terminologies that we use in the science of consciousness are dualistic terminology, and then you're going to try to frame it in a non-dualistic science. It becomes very difficult. And
who's framing it in non-dualistic?
Well, I would say the majority of science research and
you're saying materialism is non-dualism?
Yeah, the general approach to physics, chemistry, and biology is materialistic, non-dualistic, as where the general
All right.
approach.
To me, it has a dualism on the level of having these geometric models associated with it. But sure, okay. Thanks for explaining that. I get it.
Consciousness was basically always historically understood in dualistic terms, and so either you start from scratch and don't accept. I mean, that's what Ben Watkins, like a Lockean Cynthius of good old Locke again. But if you're taking the ancient dualistic understandings and then you're going to synthesize it into a materialistic understanding, and just use the dualistic terms to apply to a monistic science model, whether that's even possible. And so either you could say, okay, the philosophical and theological precursors that we have on consciousness, because they were dualistic, are all wrong. And you have to start from scratch. And so all these things like belief, even thought, or even the word I, or all these things.
Nope, they're all fine. You can keep them all.
Well, I mean, because you're doing a Lockean synthesis, even though you don't know you're doing a Lockean synthesis.
You can keep them all. The only difference is the synthesis definition of quantum mechanics, definition of observation, and our definition of observation. That's it. There's no change to anything. And I don't deny dualism. I use many dualistic type models. It's just not fundamental dualism. And that doesn't really play into much in the level of analysis.
Well, I'm saying that's the nature of interdisciplinary study, and that if you're going to draw upon theology and philosophy for consciousness and then try to map that, like the neural correlates of consciousness, and you're saying that there is, historically at least, like belief and I, and even the concept of consciousness that is known and has a lexicon that is largely dualistic in origins. And assuming that when it's like I believe, we're talking about a non-material I and a non-material belief. And then, so you want to say that there is an I believe in a science of consciousness where the I is material and the belief is material, and then you're going to search for that in some sort of neural correlates or give a physical definition, or that's what I say you're going to be an exclusionist, and you're saying in reality there is no I and there is no belief, that those were because those necessitate dualism, and if there is no dualism, there's no I and there's no belief. That's the difficulty of the interdisciplinary studies, and then people don't even realize that they're doing interdisciplinary studies because they don't know the origin of the ideas, or the canonization, or the why, what even dualism means, or why these concepts are dualistic in nature. And that, so then when you're talking about consciousness and saying, is there such a thing, or I, or belief, and then if you're going to try to derive that from the physical, as opposed to how the ancients derived, through introspection or philosophical thought, abstract thought. The Interdisciplinary Studies, the Science of Consciousness Conference, because you're focusing on medicine, physics, chemistry, neurology, it's a mess because it's all materialistic, and they don't even realize that they're using a Lockean synthesis in order to have taken these dualistic ideas and shifted them to a material understanding that may
Are you
or may
saying there fundamentally exists a incompatibility with dualism, which would posit one supreme reality, whereas the non-dualism has no absolute distinction on reality? Is that essentially what you're saying, or part of it?
Yeah, like JF and nihilism, that saying these are all preferences, or they're that you have people like Locke and Plato and Aristotle and the theology and the religion, and it's just false. It's not true. Those are just preferences of the mind, constructs of the mind that don't map onto reality. And that we have terms like I and believe, but they're not an accurate description of reality. And so when
they're an accurate description of part of reality. It's just a question of which part of reality.
Well, Well, no, I'm talking, but no, it's because you need an interdisciplinary study that you can't derive those from. If you take biology, physics, and chemistry, you can't derive those.
That's true.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we can't assume that people are alluding to the same concepts just by the sheer nominalism.
Well, I mean, it's like that's the like your Hempelian dilemma that you mentioned. You just assume
Exactly.
that,
And that's why if you want to broaden the scope of what physics encompasses, it's going to take something special. Because we are kind of stuck in this thing of what is natural. If we are stuck with a corpus that's like 4 books large in terms of knowledge, and there's potentially 60 books or 600 books, like we don't know what we don't know, basically. But yeah, you're probably going to get mad that I'm just reasserting the same thing for the millionth time. But yeah, my main points for the interdisciplinary studies was how to determine that there's shared meaning and what is realistic to expect with regards to shared meaning. What I try to do is shared intention. I don't know what it would look like exactly to share meaning in a consciousness level. I don't know what that looks like exactly.
yeah. I mean, so you see what are your axioms, and what
Yeah, we
what
could do that. We could try to break every field down into an axiomatic inference model. Like we could try to basically do what you do in your memory technique to these different disciplines.
yeah, I'm saying so. If you're in that specific consciousness,
So
you
like
really
basically every field takes the periodic table for granted. No one denies the periodic table, right?
well. No, I mean you have theological schools that reject the material realm.
But they
Whereas the,
wouldn't deny the periodic table. They might deny the material realm is the supreme reality, but they won't deny that the periodic table is something
no, I'm saying
that
if we're
exists
living.
beyond that.
Well, I mean, saying Chalmers is going to speak, I think, on Friday. But say if we're living in hologram or some sort of simulation, then
Yeah, the simulator is the
if you're going to say
periodic
that the
table.
periodic table is simulated,
It is the simulator.
or you're saying that well, that's your hypothesis. By saying that you could, so I mean, you get into just the metaphysics of it. That if you had a simulator where the periodic table, that you're hypothesizing that the periodic table is the simulator, but there could be another simulator that the periodic table
It's
is a
unfalsifiable on the
simulation.
material level
Yeah, I'm
because
saying that you have
simulator
to
is
posit even
sufficiently
that the
vague.
material that I mean, the axioms is like in biology, you take material as a given. So from physics, you don't necessarily have the axiom of material as a given. And
That's correct. Physics requires you to go deeper into the actual structural processes of matter.
then from theology, um, you don't even have to take physics as a given.
Yeah, that's why I did that one diagram where I had the progressive regression back, and the last level was theology, because that was like the ultimate pure potential, where there was like the least axiomatic strapping, if you will, at least theoretically. Like I'm basically saying philosophy is the secular version, a subset of theology, if you will. But anyway.
Yeah, that's classically like saying that physics is a subset of theology. That
and I'm saying physics would be a subset of philosophy, so a double subset of theology.
Yeah, I'm saying that it's just your lack of education of the Western tradition. That's saying that's just classically the Greek university system. That's how it was set up.
Sure.
You had your 7 sciences or theology that you're not positing it. That's just a historical phenomenon that how the system was set up, and then if it's changed till today in modern times. But historically, you had your 7 your 7 liberal arts, and physics, if it was music or rhetoric, but the theology was the umbrella subject. And philosophy is also a derivative of theology, although you have competitive schools that eliminate theology for philosophy, and then things like science would also be a derivative of philosophy, and then it's been reversed in recent times where it's became more physicalistic, and philosophy and theology is they're trying to make a derivative of the physical sciences, that would be physics, if would be the parent of all the other wisdoms. But that assumes that what's physical is real. Even to have,
are you talking about Hegelian sort of questing? The sort of summarizing.
If that's the history. I mean, if that's the history of how this happened, you're saying that why
that's a pretty accurate description.
Why we're in the paradigm that we're in, and like the names, so to say, the canonized sages. That these are the sages that canonized it to the way it is today.
Yep.
And so that's just scholarship. If you want to advance something, that's the scholarly method to the historical review. So something like consciousness has a long tradition within theology. So if you wanted to just say that that's meaningless and start with the physicalism,
I don't think it's meaningless at all. I'm saying it's incompatible with physicalism in a current understanding.
Yeah, so that's what is even the science of consciousness. And you're saying it's an oxymoron, really, because the consciousness is mind, and mind is a non-physical substance. And so you just say you're gonna. So it's the science
more
of
about incorporating the effects of consciousness into physics.
Well, you agree the science of consciousness is actually an oxymoron.
Depending on definitions, I can see why you would make that argument, because it would appear one is objective and one is subjective.
Yeah, so and if like Hamerov or the people, maybe they like a sense of humor, or they recognize the difficulty of the situation, so they just put the oxymoron in the title. But it would appear that most of the people, they don't have a classical education in the Western canon to even know that it's an oxymoron, that consciousness applies dualism. Or that
they probably don't understand why consciousness implying dualism is a problem for science.
Yeah, they probably have, it's like like I mean, it becomes the Hempelian or whatever dilemma you mentioned, where they're just assuming that, like, okay, like the ancients were onto something and they were wrong, but they were onto something, and what they were onto is going to be able to be described by physicalism, and that's what they're trying to do. But then you see that they've had a long time to do it, and they're failing to be able to recreate the classical dualistic understanding of the mind and consciousness through physicalism. So you could be
that
like,
might be a decent argument someone may want to put forward on a blog. I think it would be well substantiated.
Yeah, but so someone like JF would just reject it. So all these people were wrong, and those historical, philosophical, and theological models of consciousness were just wrong. And then came
God forbid we're more mature than that, aren't we?
When then came along, well, no, I'm talking scientific. It's not even maturity. That if you're saying that the consequence of the axiom, that JF is just following the logical consequences of the axioms, and just say that no, you have to reject the philosophical, theological traditions, what they said about this phenomenon consciousness, and reject it all. And if
You're
the
talking
logical,
about what JF would say here?
well, I mean, JF is, I'm just using him as an archetype of like a Dawkins evolutionary approach, where they didn't understand evolution. Evolution came along, it disproved classical theology and philosophy, and now there's a new approach. And so consciousness is a misnomer, in, by definition, that you might use the word consciousness, or just that, strip consciousness doesn't exist. Consciousness was a misnomer and falsification. And then you could argue about the concepts that if you're going to say that the majority of the concepts of consciousness are also false, all of them, or maybe just the majority of them, and then some of them could be derived through, so to say, evolutionary psychology, that things like belief or certain elements that are part of a dualistic theology could be grandfathered in through evolutionary psychology. And so that would be the dominant approach today. I think the majority of the people at the conference are probably not well enough steeped in the philosophical, theological tradition and have some sort of hope that they're going to be able to come up with some sort of scientific mechanism to explain that that these phenomena that people described in dualistic terminology was actually, the process was actually correct, and they were just incorrect about the dualism. And the reality is this stuff derived from evolutionary psychology, and that was the mechanism. And then these things could just be tweaked to the proper understanding within the framework of evolutionary psychology, as opposed to a straight JF approach where it's like, no, almost all of that has to be thrown in the trash, and only a handful of these things could be salvaged by evolutionary psychology, and the rest of them are just plain wrong.
Are you speculating are you asking what it's going to be like in the future? Or are you just leaving that as an open question?
Well, I'm laying that out as the present state.
Okay.
So the majority of the people are, the dissonance of accepting nihilism and evolutionary psychologists is too large. So they're hoping that evolutionary psychology is really all they have. So like the current model of evolution, really they're hoping that evolutionary psychology is going to grandfather in these dualistic concepts. However, that appears less and less likely the case. So the Doooovid school is that we're going to backtrack on evolution and reject evolution and go back to dualism and theology, but saying that is extremely unlikely. And so I would say actually the likelihood of JF winning is much higher, and that I'm still in the theological dualistic camp, and saying there would have to be some, and I would understand it in theological terms, like, okay, there's going to be Armageddon and a civilizational collapse, and then there'll be a collapse in the theory of evolution, and we could go back to dualism, but it's going to take some sort of great reset, God forbid, biblical catastrophe to cause this great reset, and that's also creates an extremely large dissonance. But have a theological understanding that because that's the way God designed it, and that's what goes along with biblical scripture or Talmudic predictions of these frameworks of dissolution, and the restoration of truth. If you even have like a Vedic model of cycles of where falsity will become dominant, and then there has to be some great reset to the restoration of truth. But that's not a scientific approach, and then that's accepting something non-scientific like scripture. But from the Kuhnian revolution sense, we would have to end the paradigm of evolution. And so if you say that Doooovid's an accelerationist by trying to convince people of, well, these are the natural conclusions of evolution. So if you're really trying to forward these scientific materialistic understandings, you have to stop, you have to just reject dualism and all of the benefits that came with theological dualism. So it's kind of like an acceleration that, like, okay, you could go to hell, so just reject God in totality. Right now you've given time to repent and you have some, like, a little faith in God. So what we're trying to do is get you completely to reject God so you could be destroyed. And in terms of that would be like, take the side of evolution, take the side of complete atheism so that you could be destroyed. And like T-jump or something like that, and God forbid that's my understanding, but that's a theological understanding. And we're talking the science of consciousness, then we're just putting axiomatically, that's what I'm talking about, interdisciplinary study and these questions of dualism, and just informing people that consciousness, mind, come from a dualistic understanding. If you reject that dualistic understanding, these concepts you probably also have to reject. It's just like, if JF is your guru, just make him your guru. Enough with like the New Age best of both worlds, like Ben Watkins and his Hegelian synthesis.
Is that an argument at me?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if it put you in that fact, if you call yourself like an impersonalist pantheist, that you say, like, no, I mean, pick a side. The war's coming. Pick a side, and I think you're on JF's side. I think you're on T-Jump's side.
Okay, so you think I'm on the side of the materialistic atheists?
Well, you're like a fence sitter, but
I'm a fence sitter with regards to a question that nobody knows the answer to. Gee, I wonder why. If people can't coherently answer a question, does it make sense to take a side?
Well, then you have to have the theological precursors, because I have answers to those questions, but they're based on theology.
Alrighty.
They're saying, okay, why are you a fence sitter? What's the purpose of allowing you to be a fence sitter? And what theologically would happen that you would be forced off the fence, and you're likely to be on the JFT jump side. And if you wanted to put in that sense of
force dichotomy is probably the last thing for interdisciplinary studies.
It's like monism.
To say, pick a side as soon as somebody's joining something is a good way to get them to say, oh, forget it. This isn't going to happen. So first of all, if we're going to do interdisciplinary studies, really shouldn't be these kinds of labels like that. People should assert their domain of expertise and be honest about it.
That is because that's theology.
You want to make that a label, that's sort of like, okay, but it's a very pragmatic label.
No, I mean, that's theology. So then you have a level of question of expertise, and saying, well, that is my theology. That's even say mainstream theology. That if you're having interdisciplinary study and you say, well, I reject that. I reject your theology. I reject your expertise. And either you say, okay, do you reject theology in totality, or are you advancing a different theology and then an establishment of expertise? So that's just saying, is theology included in the interdisciplinary studies?
Well, do you think it's a question? It's not about whether it's included. It's where's the line? At what point does one become the deciding factor versus another?
Well,
and the overarching themes in modernity, it's unclear who the authority on consciousness is, if there even is a unified authority.
Yeah, so there's a multiple truth hypothesis. You would have a truth discovery function, and it would have some sort of weighting function. So if you have interdisciplinary studies and even you have competitive understandings within a discipline, like like theology, that you would have to have a truth discovery function and a weighting factor. And so if like it has to equal one, so to say, that what's the weighting factor of theology, what's the weighting factor of physics.
Well,
And
no,
so
it doesn't happen like that necessarily. Usually it's incompatible. There's no weighting function. It's not a superposition of percentages or probabilities. It's stop, start, stop, starts.
what
It's
is
like
and
a
so even
doctor
that's
versus a
the
dentist.
likelihood of like the collapse of the wave function, that it would also have a weighting factor and like a probability curve, and saying that is, if you like the Schrodinger's, where's the particle and what's the likelihood the particle is in a given realm. And if you compare like the
No,
chart.
it's what's the best interpretation of particle, of wave function, of all these things. What's the best interpretation for the purposes of physicalism, and put the stuff that's going to cause problems to the side, friction, so to
But
speak.
so the wave equation is weighted, and then you're to just say that is it likely to
Yeah,
be in theology or physics, or saying it's spread out where there's
it's
an
weighted,
element.
and maybe that's not the best way to understand it, right? So that's the question: is who gets to interpret probabilities is a person who's an expert on probabilities. Now, at no point does theology trump probabilities, because probability is fundamentally a mathematical concept. That's how I'm kind of looking at
Yeah,
it.
I'm not saying who. That's saying it'd be a truth discovery function. That wouldn't be a who interprets it. There'd be a truth discovery function, an algorithm that would do it. And so to say, in theory, it would be objective.
Do you really think I'm going to agree with that? Or do you think most people would agree with that? I guess it doesn't matter what I say, but do you think most people would believe that? Like, if we're
Well,
talking about interdisciplinary, to me, it's like people have to agree on the basic, you say axioms, right? Like just the basic principles they have to agree on them. I
no,
don't
I
know if
mean,
you're going to get people on
what me
board
or
with
you think is irrelevant. It's saying we're not me or you aren't going to be able to discover the truth. It's beyond us. So it's saying the method towards truth that we could that just saying that if there's is a truth, there could be a method to figure out the truth that's beyond us. And saying
there
that
is a method to know things. It's well established, called pramana. And then there's also Sankhya from Ayurveda. So these things have
yeah,
been well
that's
established.
theology. You're back in
That is not
theology.
theology.
It is
Ayurveda is
it is
science.
theology.
All right, you want to say it's theology? I'd say it's science. Fine. It's whatever.
Well, I'm saying even like, why are you thinking something better? You think like, oh, it's science, and now it's better than I'm saying it's theology.
I'm saying that to describe Ayurveda as theology is not accurate. It's more accurate to say science, but I would say it's medical science is most accurate way to describe it.
Actually, more accurate to saying, are you diminishing it by saying it's science and not theology?
I
Or you
think
saying
that it's
I'm
a matter of
diminishing
what's
it
the
by saying
accurate
it's I'm
translation.
diminishing it by saying it's
I don't think
theology,
you're
not
diminishing
science.
it. I don't think you're diminishing it because I think you have a good intention. And
I'm
to
saying you're
me,
the one diminishing it by saying it's
oh,
science,
okay.
not theology.
I said it was scientific. Now you're saying it's theology. That is that going to be understood as for what it is? Is that going to
And saying
represent it?
why do you even like saying you're saying like it's science, like, so like, we just said, well, that means it's lesser than theology.
Well, no, theology and science are different domains. It's not about lesser or whatever. It's about domain of it's about precision
Well,
of
science is
assertion.
a subdivision of theology. And so if you're saying it's
Yeah,
science, you're saying it's lesser. It's not even in the purview of the greater field of theology. And so if it's like medicine, that it only has to deal with the human body, and so it
yeah, because
doesn't
the
have to deal
story
with
is
it
preached.
doesn't have to deal with the greater truths. So you just
Well,
diminished it. You're saying if it's not in theology, it can't answer the larger questions. It could only answer. So it's in a medical
exactly.
science.
Yeah, yeah.
So
That's,
so so you
but
didn't make.
because it's scientific, I can repurpose it for theology. I suppose is what I was
No,
slightly
you
alluding
can't.
to. But okay.
No, I mean you're. I don't mean that's you're a product of the modern system where you think saying it's scientific is like, some sort of trump, when in reality it's a diminutive, not a superlative. Saying it's theological is a superlative. That means it could answer all questions. If it's scientific, it could only answer material questions.
And Ayurveda is really only about medicine.
Yeah, but that's not pramana. So you said pramana is not Ayurvedic. That's theology. You're saying Ayurveda might be.
Pramana comes out of debate. So that's not theological either. That's philosophical.
But I mean, it's not a material wisdom.
Material,
Science.
If you mean like solid state physics, that's considered to be a subset of the mind.
So I'm saying the sciences, if you're saying those are material, or even use the word material sciences, and it just gets back to this interdisciplinary studies. And it's just
exactly.
Saying, like,
it's right now.
If there's a greater truth, there's either a hierarchy, and if there's not a hierarchy, there's either equal distribution or there's a weighted distribution. So
in some cases, it makes sense
by a weighting factor. So if it's interdisciplinary studies and there's not a hierarchy where one is really contained within the other, so it's saying really all there is theology, and all the other disciplines are sub-disciplines of theology. Or you're saying that there's theology is one of the disciplines and there isn't a hierarchy, and then what does it mean if theology is and everything else is a subdivision, that's a meaningless self-reference, that you still have to go through the sub-disciplines, and you have a question of a weighting factor of
yes.
That's right. If
you're right on track
mathematically,
that's good.
that all adds up to one, and the weights of all of the various disciplines will add up to one.
You were on track for a while. It fell apart at a certain part because you're presuming that there's like democracy where there isn't always necessarily democracy, whereas like a lot of times it comes down to
it's a possibility. It could be equally distributed, or it could have weighted distribution.
Yep. Yeah, so I think I'm starting to see your multiple truth framework now.
So if there's weighted distribution, you would have to have some sort of truth discovery function that would, so either, call estimate, or, use the word discover the weight. And so it's not like there wouldn't be an expertise that I would figure it out. It would be, there'd be a method or an algorithm or a discovery function, and the weight would be discovered. And then if there was a weighting factor, then that would be used in a method that if you had your interdisciplinary studies, and it could be the weighting factor would have to be unique for every inquiry, that you couldn't find, there wouldn't be some sort of universal weighting that would be used for all inquiries, that every inquiry would have its own unique weighting.
As long as it was mediated by expert opinions, you could definitely parameterize it that way.
No, I mean, expert opinions is mind-dependent, subjective. Saying the truth discovery function in theory would be
Computer is worse for mind-dependent errors than experts.
Why is it saying that the theoretical truth discovery function is objective? It's not mind dependent. It's not dependent on expertise. Saying it's a factual description.
Dependent on the mind of the person who implemented it on the computer.
Well, yeah, I just think if there's a computer, like algorithms, there was Boole and there was a theory, and then you had vacuum tubes and mechanical devices and eventually a computer. But I was saying theoretically the algorithm is enough for the solution, and whether we're capable of understanding the solution, and just think hypothetically what truth is, and even if we can't figure out the truth, due to our own limitations, but so you could, if you're talking about us and our path towards figuring out truth, then you have the factor of expertise, and expertise is also a weighting function. But if you're talking objectively, or if the thought experiment, like a computer that would have some sort of truth discovery function that would be objective and mind independent, it wouldn't be based on expertise. It would be based on just the algorithm, the pure algorithm.
Yeah, and if that's how you do it, then no one is ever responsible for anything. But if you have expertise, then every
Was
piece
no
of
you. I'm saying
information someone
whether
is
there's
responsible
whether
for.
we know the truth or not is independent from the truth. And even say whether we could create an algorithm that could potentially know the truth is different than whether we could know the truth. Even I hypothesize this.
It depends if all truths are algorithmic or not.
Well, I didn't say the truth is algorithm. You could create an algorithm that could determine the truth. Not that the truth itself would be algorithmic. But I mean, that's the saying even why interdisciplinary study, because there's just theoretically the theology that all other knowledges are derived from, but in reality that we have disciplines, and we don't have an umbrella head that contains all the disciplines. We just have various disciplines that have conflicting axioms. And then if we have truths,
I don't know that there's conflicting axioms necessarily. There may be axioms which are in some implementations incompatible, but contradictory axioms, that seems, I've never seen anything that would suggest
conflicting or contradictory, but is saying that they're overlapping. They're not the same axioms. There's difference in the axioms that they might largely coincide, but there's overlap and difference, that the axioms are not the same. And if you could have truth within a discipline, but the truths that you could find from a discipline are limited. And so the greater, more important truths take interdisciplinary work. And then if you want to call not contradictory axioms, but different axioms, that would lead to contradictory conclusions. And so when you have an interdisciplinary field, you would have to deal with that. And we use statistical methods for that. For science we use statistical methods, and that comes out like an algorithm and a function. Because there's uncertainty and there's estimation, and then we would use an algorithmic estimating function that would compensate for the discrepancies.
Yep, and that's never going to work. But it's a nice dream. It's the same, to me, it's just as kooky as what the evolutionists are saying. The computer is going to solve it for us.
Well, no, I'm not claiming the computer is going to solve it. I'm saying
to me, that's what you're saying. Now, you want to say that's not what you're saying, that it's objective. It's like, what's objective about a bunch of weighting functions that
it's mathematics? It's algorithm. So it's like Boolean logic existed before the computer, and then we built a computer that implemented
assertion with no evidence that Boolean logic pre-existed it being formalized as a system.
Well, it did.
Assertion with no evidence. You cannot establish that. I understand the argument, but how would you evidentiate that? That's just a definitional thing.
That circuit logic existed before circuits.
All right.
I mean, Boole wrote 150 years ago before circuits, and now then the circuits were eventually created and implemented. Just like the Turing machine, the algorithms were created before the computers that implemented the algorithm. So I'm talking about an algorithm, and then the potential that there would eventually be a computer that would implement this algorithm. But so I'm just talking about the creation of an algorithm. And so we say that the algorithm potentially, theoretically, would lead to the solution, and then the potentiality that there would be a computer that would be able to implement the algorithm enough to at least estimate the solution, to whatever error rate that would be predicted from the algorithm.
How do you define a solution when you don't know Like, sorry, and how do you define an error when you don't know how correct your estimation is?
Well, I'm saying that the algorithm would compute its own error.
Yeah. So it's going to do something you can't do. That's magical thinking.
No, I'm saying I'd be able to do a few permutations of the algorithm myself, and you see the error rate. I mean, they're saying like perturbation theory.
Error rate that is not objective in any way, shape, or form.
Well, it's saying that it's as objective as thought or mathematics. So it's saying as close as we could get to truth is the algorithm.
So not objective at all?
Well, I mean, because objective means mind independent. So like, no, we're not going to get to anything objective. We're mind dependent. That's something that you could create something in theory, that the algorithm is mind independent, that the algorithm in existence could be continue in existence separate from our minds.
Even though it was created by a human mind.
Yeah, I'm saying that it's mind independent, even if it's a product
so what
of
is
mind.
About it that it is independent?
So the fact that it was created by mind doesn't mean that it's mind independent. Just like if you make a device.
The whole thing is if it's created by a mind, it's mind dependent. So the computer is mind dependent. The question is whether there is also a universal mind, not whether the things we create are created by us.
No, I mean, if it's created by mind, it's only mind dependent if it's still dependent upon the creator. If it's created and then it's independent from its creator, it's mind independent. It doesn't matter that it was created by mind. If it's been emancipated, it's independent.
How does emancipation happen exactly?
If you're talking like a device, like I showed yesterday, like I mean, I something electric, but if it was solar, like a solar powered automatic light, it was created by mind, but it's mind independent, that it doesn't that it will, my parents' house, they have lights outside, have solar. Yeah,
it has autonomous functioning.
It was a product of mind, but now it's mind independent.
Okay, it has autonomous functioning. It was still created by a mind, but it now has an autonomous capacity to function. Like I can just leave my computer on and come back and it's fine. So it can work if I'm not at it, you know? So is that what you mean by mind independent?
Yeah, I give the example like a solar power automatic light that charges by day and is lit at least for a period at night. It's a product of mind, but then it's autonomous and it operates mind independently. That's different than
establish it's independent of mind. You can establish that it's autonomous, though. That's why the wording is very confusing. But it's fine.
I'm saying that it's mind independent. That there's a complete disconnect.
How do you establish that, though? You're saying now autonomous is mind independent, okay? Well, then like a fish tank filter is mind independent.
Yeah, I mean the same way.
A fridge is mind independent. Does that make sense that a fridge is mind independent?
Yeah.
Okay, so is an abacus mind independent? Like, where does it end?
Well, yes, I mean, saying if you say that a device doesn't have a mind, it's mind independent.
Okay, so now you're saying a device isn't alive. It doesn't have a brain.
We're saying
we don't know what it means for a device to have a mind.
If you're gonna posit that it has a mind, that a refrigerator.
I'm not positing that. I'm saying it's not defined right now. That is a meaningless statement at this time.
Well, I just said it. Example of a mind independent thing that create the fact that it was created by a mind doesn't mean that it's mind dependent. Just give it, if you use
That would appear to be what it does mean in my understanding, but where is that
you're
wrong?
saying a refrigerator is mind dependent.
Well, sure, somebody invented it, or probably a bunch of people together. I mean, for a while they were probably just burying stuff in caves. I've been in some underground caves where there was ice, so those were like fridges, natural ones, and then eventually they were like, hey. Anyway,
Yes, I was saying that's
I'm
mind
sure
independent.
Cornelius
Doesn't matter that it was invented.
refrigerator or whatever the hell his name is. I'm sure someone invented what I'm looking at right now as a design at some point. Yeah, as a product of their mind. Everything we have in civilization is a product of our minds.
Yeah, but it doesn't mean it's mind dependent. Product of mind doesn't mean mind dependent. This thing is a
Well,
product.
in my understanding, it does, but clearly
Well, why
that's
is it
not the
dependent?
case.
How is the refrigerator dependent on mind?
Because if there were no humans, there would be no refrigerators.
The origin of it doesn't mean it's dependent. You're saying you're dependent
You're
on your
saying
mother.
it's independent at some time when I don't see how you're drawing that
You're
boundary.
dependent on your mother. You're dependent on your creator. You say like, well, no, you were created by your mother, but at some point you became independent. You're not dependent upon your mother. You're not dependent upon.
So the fridge doesn't have personal growth as it gets older and matures and has various relationships.
Yeah, so it operates mind independently.
Okay. I see what you're saying. It doesn't have any more evolution, but it still has a function as a machine.
Yeah, that's independent of the mind that created it.
Okay. So it's a non-evolving system. That's fair enough.
Well, it happens to be a non-evolving system, but even if it was an evolving system, you're saying that it doesn't matter that it was created by mind. To being created by mind doesn't make it mind dependent.
So being mind dependent means being subjected to a mind, and being subjected to a mind means being subjected to evolution.
Well, I don't know why you're bringing evolution here.
Well, because you said that I'm dependent on my mother, but I've grown up since then, and I'm saying that
these circular arguments.
It's not circular.
It is, because we're not getting anywhere. You're saying I said my point, and you're just arguing that I think it's getting anywhere. So let me just go to sleep and try to prepare for the conference tomorrow. Like, I'd rather learn things than just have these pointless arguments that are just circular, that they're not even like interesting to me or to anybody. I don't know if you enjoy this or something, or you think you're gaining from this. I don't feel I'm gaining from this.
Well, I had no clue what you meant by mind independent, so I appreciated that. It definitely makes more sense now, and hopefully it'll be more fun next time.
I'm not doing this for fun. No,
or hopefully it'll be more beneficial next time. I mean, beneficial.
Okay, so have a great night, and see you at the conference tomorrow.
See you then. Bye.